Hello and welcome to this programming tutorial. In today's tutorial, we're going to show you how to do total, how to count, how to keep the minimum, and how to work out the maximum. These are basic things to learn, and we've covered them before in some extent, but it's worth learning and making sure that you practice it throughout your programming practice. So what is counting? Counting is just keeping the counts of a number of times a particular action is performed. Let's look at an example. Let's say I have a variable called count that I assign the value 0 to. I can say here, while count is less than 120, print hello, and then make count plus equal 1. Remember, plus equal 1 is just a shortcut for writing count equals count plus 1. In other words, whatever it currently is plus 1. By initializing this variable outside of the loop, I am now keeping a count of how many times this loop runs. Now, it doesn't have to be specific to the loop. If I do for I in range 0 to 150, it now doesn't have any specific reason to connect to count, but I'm still counting how many times it runs inside my loop. Likewise, totaling is when you want to get the sum of something. Let's say we've got the amount of marks that a student is getting in an exam, and that equals 0. And let's say that the total marks, or the question total, let's do Q total, equals 70 marks. And we want to work out how many marks out of 70 a student has got. Well, I can say here, for I in range 0 to my question total, in other words, I'm going to create a for loop here that iterates from 0 to the number of questions there are. Let's assume that every question is worth 1 mark. And what I can do here is I can take an input. So let's say user input, or say user mark is equal to an input. Or let's say enter the mark for question I. I'm going to put a little F here at the front. So if every question is worth 1 mark and there are 70 questions, I'm going to ask the user to enter the mark for question I being 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and so on. I can then say marks equals marks, or plus equals if you want to use a shortcut, plus the user mark to add it to my total marks. Now this program will have an error in it. Can you spot the error? It'll have a type error because marks is an integer and the input is a string. Let's convert the input into an integer over here, and we'll assume that the user always puts in an integer. Now I can work out the total marks. It just totals it by running through the loop all the way through the end of the questions and entering what mark the user got. The cool thing about this is after it, I can print marks divided by the Q total to work out a percentage. If I multiply it by 100, and I'll work out a percentage of what the user got. Let's test it. If I say there are 5 marks, or 5 questions in the exam, and I hit run, I can say, right, mark for question 0 is 5. Oh, we're doing 1 mark per question, so I shouldn't put 5 as a mark. 1 mark for question 1, 0 marks for question 2, 1 mark for question 3, 1 mark, 0 marks. I get a total of 60% for the exam. This is what totaling is. We also have the minimum and maximum. This is when we want to work out the minimum value being entered or what the maximum value being entered is. To work out the maximum value, it's quite simple. Let's do a for loop here for I in range 0 to 100, or we'll do 0 to 5 again so we can test it. And remember, just to mention, if we don't have a third parameter here, it's going to automatically add 1 to I at the end of every loop. And all we're going to do here is same thing. We'll have user input equals the int version of the input, enter a number. And we're going to try and work out what the maximum and minimum values are between the number ranges entered. So let's create a variable to store this. Variable can be called maximum. And we're going to make this equal 0. The reason we're making this equal 0 is because 0 is going to be our lowest limit. You shouldn't be able to put anything under 0. I mean, in this program you could, but we're going to assume that the user won't put anything under 0. Now that we have the lowest value here, we're guaranteed that the next value here is likely going to be higher than the maximum value, unless the user enters 0 every single time, in which case the maximum will just stay at 0. After the for loop, we can print out the maximum over here. So now that we have the maximum and we have the user inputs and we're printing it out, let's actually work out the maximum. We'll do a selection statement for this. If the user input, and this is why we have to convert it to an integer, is greater than the maximum, then we're going to set the maximum to equal whatever the user input is. Notice we don't use greater than or equal to. It'll be a waste of time to check if it's equal to, because if it's equal to, we're just going to reassign it itself. So it's easier or more efficient to just say greater than. So let's see if the maximum is worked out. We've got 5, or let's enter 1, 5, 2, 3, 1. The maximum number is 5, and that's correct. Now, what about the minimum value? Let's change this all. Instead of the maximum here, let's put minimum. We'll have minimum instead of maximum. And the changes we're going to have to make is we're going to have to say if user input is less than the minimum. Let's see what happens when I run the program. Remember, we switched the values over here. If I put the same values, 1, 5, 2, 3, 0, we get 0 over here. But if I allow negative numbers, and let's say I put 5 minus 1, 2, 3, I get -1 here as a minimum value. But if I run this again, and I put 1, 5, 2, 3, 5, I still get 0 as a minimum value. That's because minimum is set to 0, which means it's already the lowest value. Now, I could fix this by changing this to a high value, like this, but there is a chance that the user will enter a value higher or lower than this. Python has a really cool feature. We can actually represent infinity as a number. To do this in Python, you write floats and inf. It seems a bit weird, but all you have to understand is by writing float inf, or in other words, typecasting inf, we'll create an infinite number. This means now that minimum at the beginning is set to an infinite number. So no matter what the user enters, their first value will definitely be less than the minimum value, and it will change. This is a cool little feature that Python has. Additionally, if I were to enter a couple of numbers, let's say 50, number 2 equals 20, number 3 equals 40, and number 4 equals 100, Python has inbuilt subroutines for the minimum and maximum value. I can print the minimum value between number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4, or I can print the maximum value out of those 4 variables. See? Now, you might ask yourself, well, why is this useful when I have to create all the variables individually? And what if I have 100 numbers to run through? And you're right, it wouldn't be useful in that sense. What we did before would serve you better. However, later on in the lessons, when we get to lists, min and max will become much, much more important. So might as well get used to it now. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful.